Welcome back to Permission Slip Granted. What even is the gay agenda? In this myth-busting episode, Kylie and Sydney unpack the fear, the media spin, and the lived truth behind queerness, love, and visibility. Kylie shares her journey from Mormon ally to out and proud pansexual, raising a trans child and healing internalized shame. Sydney brings honest curiosity, deep questions, and stories from her Southern upbringing, and the unexpected wisdom of her dance career. We talk religion, resistance, and what it really means to live without apology. Spoiler, the real gay agenda is brunch, joy, and has nothing to do with traumatizing kids. Whether you're queer, questioning, or just ready to challenge old assumptions, this one's for you.
Funny because I had a conversation with my dad about this yesterday. Yeah, we talked about how I am uncertain about some things, and I talked about you and the fact that I can't condemn this. I can't condemn sexuality like the church does, because he goes, he was brought up, you're either male or you're female. And I told him about you, and I said, Daddy, what if I was born with both genitalia? Like, what would you do when the doctors did X amount of tests and they said, well, she's probably a girl? Well, we don't know. You have to decide. And he didn't say anything. He couldn't.
Yeah.
And I was like, Daddy, there are just certain things that I cannot condemn, and I cannot say that I know for certain this is wrong. Absolutely not. I was like, what would you do? I would used to say, I would never do this until I do it. And then I'm like, served a big bowl of soup, spicy soup, and I can't swallow it. So, and he's quiet, and which what I love about him is that when he does that, he's letting it marinate.
Right.
And I know that's really uncomfortable for him. So I know that has some sort of effect on him. And I love that he let me just say how I felt. And I overpowered the conversation a little bit because, I know what he believes. Because I grew up 9 o'clock strict bedtime because Ally McBeal came on after Friends, and guess what? There were lesbians in that episode.
Right.
And they were like, that's wrong, Sydney. And I was like, okay. But anyway, I'm going on tangents.
No, I think I'm going to totally use this in the episode. All right, everybody, welcome back to Permission Slip Granted. Sydney and I are here today, and we are going to be doing some myth busting. We are talking about the gay agenda. And we want to be real clear here that this is not an attack or a call out. We actually plan to just bust this open and hopefully give you some things to think about. It's not our place to change your mind. And the only way we grow as humans is to look at new information, additional information, and then make informed decisions. So this gay agenda, which apparently involves brunch and pride flags and not traumatizing our kids, it's been this thing that is weaponized in the media, but nobody can actually define it, right? So I want to take you back to when I was Mormon, which was 35 years of my life. And as a teenager, there were some kids at my school who were openly gay. And I remember struggling with it even then, to be like, I don't understand how my religious beliefs can think that these people are automatically not going to be able to live with God. And then over the years, it changed. It was like the doctrine of the church went from like everything about it is evil to, well, you can be a Mormon as long as and be gay as long as you don't act on the sexual tendencies. And I'm like, that now I'm just like, are you fucking kidding me? That's just unacceptable to ask of a human. But then I was like, oh, okay, so there is a way for them to be, within this sphere of Mormonism. There were some additional pieces throughout my years where church doctrine would change. That's a whole separate conversation that we will have at some point, deconstructing my faith, and how doctrines would change. And so there were some that were very hurtful in the 2010s, around LGBTQ plus parents, in that if you were a member of the church and you were part of the queer community, your kids were not allowed to be baptized. And there was a large wave of suicides actually as a result of this. And I don't know the stats and I don't know the specifics if it was the parents or the kids affected. I just know that it was a lot of young people that ended up taking their own lives over this because it's their religion. And a lot of this happened in Utah. And so beyond religion, there's that cultural aspect of they grew up in this framework. So it was pretty controversial. I struggled with it. And in the few years leading up to me leaving, I definitely was of the mindset of, this is something that the church has wrong, but I will just deal with it when I meet God, I guess. And so I was an ally and definitely didn't see eye to eye with the organization. Fast forward another year and a half after I left is when I came out as pansexual. And in doing a lot of work looking at my past, I realized there were a number of friendships with female presenting people that ended because I had romantic feelings for them and didn't know how to deal with that, right? This was a part of me that was so closed off. I didn't even, I did not recognize it until I was 35. So that's where I'm at now. I'm within the community. I have had relationships with both genders. Pansexual is different in that, to me, it doesn't matter what genitalia my partners have. I'm really there about the energy that this person brings. And I think that's important to distinguish and to make sure that there's no calling out. Like if somebody doesn't want to be with somebody who has a penis, that shouldn't be a big deal. Just like somebody doesn't want to be with somebody who has a vulva, that shouldn't be a big deal, right? But that is the difference between, say, a bisexual and a pansexual. It typically is tied to that genitalia experience. On top of that, I also am raising a transgender child. So the queer community is near and dear to my heart. So many of my dear friends are members of it. And I'll pause there so you can ask me a question.
I guess my first question would be, or I know my first question would be, how would you, in a few sentences, decolonize the gay agenda?
So I think it's primarily a fear tactic, and people fear what they don't understand. So to me, the gay agenda is to have equal rights and have everybody stop telling us we don't exist and stop telling us that we have to live within a Judeo-Christian framework. What the media portrays it as is that we are forcing people to be gay, to be transgender, and we're doing so through things within society like drag shows and more accurate sexual education. These are allowing this agenda to be pushed onto people. So that's my view and what I believe the societal view is of the gay agenda.
Okay. And what has been your experience with outside judgment, and hate towards your sexuality?
I am very fortunate in that I live in a very liberal place. So I have not experienced any sort of judgment or hate or negativity toward me when I'm out with my girlfriend, right? Um, Now I have spent time in Utah and had a different girlfriend at that time. And yeah, when we would hold hands and we were out in public, heaven forbid we kissed, there definitely were some stares. There were definitely some hateful looks happening. Never had any comments made. But also there were a few reassuring looks or supportive nods. So it was nice that even though there was that negativity, there also seemed to be an equal amount of support. I think it's important to remember that sexuality is fluid. It's not a fixed state. It's definitely something that can change over time, just as your preference for salty or sweet can change over time. This is just a part of the human experience. And so if we look at it from that perspective and less as a binary thing, you are one thing, which as humans, we want to label because it is easier for our brain to make quick judgments, right? Back in the day when we were, hunter gatherers, you needed to be able to assess quickly outsider versus tribe member because outsider could be potentially dangerous, right? We have all these things still hardwired within our DNA, within our biological makeup. The problem is we see outsiders, they're not necessarily inherently dangerous in the same way that they were then. But our bodies and our brains still have that sensation. And so we have to work to override that when that happens and we look at people with labels, whether it is something in the lines of racism or within the LGBTQ community. But there was an interesting study, Sydney, that was done at a college, and you can look it up. So I just don't remember what college, and I don't remember a lot of the details, but basically they showed people different clips of pornography and had people write about were they aroused or were they not. Mm-hmm. And they started with heterosexual, right? And people had to say how they sexually identified, right? So there were homosexuals, heterosexuals, like lots of different sexualities in this study. That way they could get a nice, grouping and look at it. So they showed heterosexual, they showed lesbian porn, and then they showed gay porn, 2 gay men. And what was fascinating was that the heterosexual males claimed they were not aroused. And I saved this little kicker for you. But for the men, maybe it was only men in this study. I don't know. I can't remember. But I know for the men, they had some sort of electrical hookup, whether it was specifically to their genitalia or to their brain. But either way, their body absolutely responded and was aroused to the gay porn, even when they were emphatically insisting that they weren't. And in fact, the more they insisted they weren't, the more aroused they actually were. So there is something here in the talking about the fear where a lot of it, there are probably a lot of people out there that have homophobia, that have fear of the LGBTQ community, because there's some part of that within them. And instead of taking the risk and the time to figure out, like, am I more like 80% heterosexual and just a little bit here, and reevaluate, and okay, well, I don't want to change anything. I still enjoy being married to the person I am, or dating the person that I am currently dating. Instead of looking at it from a possibility, it's like they just can't, it's so closed off, they cannot approach it. Because, for at least this is something that I believed, because if the church is wrong about that, what else is the church wrong about?
Yeah, I think really what it is, like, God is so big. And here I am, I'm trying not to make this personal, but life is a personal experience. And if we're not being true to ourselves, then what are we doing here? I definitely believe there's a God. I've questioned God. I've been mad at him at times, and I'm not ashamed to admit it because I'm a human. Is this really, how can God create something and condemn it? Like, because I don't think he makes mistakes in the fact that creating who we are, from before before in the womb, before we even existed, he knew us by name. How could he do that? And how could he also pit us against each other and make us all self-righteous and say, hey, now now we are playing God. Who's playing God here? Is it God, or is it us? Am I making sense to you?
Yeah, and I think that is a big piece. When you look at the Bible specifically, homosexuality is mentioned 5 times, whereas adultery is mentioned, I want to say 43. So when you're looking at like the prevalence of sexual sin within a religious environment, it seems to me that there's far more of an issue of adultery than there is of homosexuality, right? But yet, uh, when you look at pastors and things like that, somebody made a TikTok about this, and that's why I know these bits right off the bat. Was talking about this one particular anti or a homophobic minister when she had cheated on her husband, broke up another marriage with the person she cheated with, and then went on to do it again, and is just so outspoken about homosexuality, and yet her sexual sin is not being discussed. So I think it is based in fear. The hate is based in fear. They and it's easy to weaponize that. And if God doesn't make mistakes within, and within my experience in the religious community, that very much was the belief, then the only other option is, well, these people are choosing it and they're sinning. And I think that it all boils down to this binary thinking that gets us into trouble. We want things to be one or the other because it's simpler that way. But the truth is, as we've evolved as humans, even if some of our coding hasn't quite evolved, we have. So we have to make the cognitive choice to develop and evolve with society. And we can't just stay within antiquated beliefs that are based in fear.
So what I'm hearing is, like, ultimately it's too painful to look inward and question our morals. People are it's way too painful because, oh my gosh, what if we did And oh, now all of a sudden we're a hypocrite. Now what do we do?
Exactly.
How do we live with ourselves? And then how do we explain all the little details, because we can't admit that about ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think there's just I'm saying all of this and all of these questions that I've asked you is not to prove a point or my bias, a bias on my point, but I want our viewers to ask those questions, to challenge themselves to look inward. I mean, you're not perfect. No one is, unless you're a narcissist or whatever. But, you know, there's so much gray area in life, and we are so quick to point fingers at each other. And really, like, how do we define hate? How do we define control? And how do we define ourselves, right? And how would you describe to someone, say me, that I came up to you and I just said, hey, Kylie, you have sex with other women? How is that the same than same sex? I mean, heterosexual. Like, how would you explain to them your relationship with a heterosexual versus a homosexual relationship? How would you explain that to someone who doesn't understand white from black?
So my first question would be, my first statement would actually be a question back of, are you asking me to explain the mechanics of lesbian sex? Because, right. And I mean that kind of cheeky, but also like my literal autistic brain is like, is that what you're asking? But what I think you're asking is more maybe like the relation dynamics, because typically what we see is that kind of more what you mean?
There's no right or wrong.
Okay.
What would be the first thing that, you know, I think what I have experienced other people who are in a religious, organization.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of, as soon as they hear a homosexual, and they do it initially like they know for sure it's wrong. And if all I hear is fear, and that's just behavioral, that's something they learned, growing up, like racism, right?
Right.
And they just know for certain. So, and they know for sure that or we think we know for sure that they're, heterosexual. And also there's shame behind that, as we can also tell. But what's the first thing that pops into mind? How would you explain that to them?
Well, I would probably ask them, like, are you actually wanting to have a conversation, or are you wanting to just tell me that I'm wrong based on your beliefs, right? Because if we're actually going to have a conversation, okay. But if you want to tell me I'm wrong, I don't have space for that. And you get to, at the end of the day, you get to believe what you believe. So that is how I would start the conversation. And if they actually wanted to have a conversation, how I would handle it is, I want to be respectful to your religious beliefs. And in order for you to try and put yourself in my shoes, you have to set that framework aside, because those aren't my religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. So if you're willing to do that, then we can talk a little bit more about this. Okay. I would also follow up and say that there is a difference between morals and ethics. So, helping them understand that, your morals are those are your intrinsic values and how you move through the world. And they are very much shaped by religion. If you are a religious person, right? There's no getting around that. Ethics are about everyone and the fact that we are all humans. And so when someone who is gay wants to be married, that's not hurting anybody who's religious and wants to be married. They are simply asking for the same right, because here are two humans that love one another and want to commit to one another. And they want to be able to have the same tax benefits as a heterosexual couple, right? There, you have to look at it from this perspective as well. Health insurance, right? These things that are tied to marriage, why should they be denied, ethically speaking, not morally speaking, but ethically speaking? Why should they be denied to two people just because they happen to be of the same gender or presenting as the same gender? And typically, if you can bring it to that level and it's, stayed in a calm state, people will either stay silent, right? Because they aren't, the cognitive issues that they're facing of, well, but this is what I've been told, this is what I believe, and okay, there's some logical sense here, right? That it's so hard for them to be able to typically, and I know I'm generalizing, to set that aside and be able to look at it that from that perspective. But occasionally people will be able to hear that and say, oh, I guess I didn't think about it that way.
Is the hate that you experience from the outside, is it the same as hate, like hating racism, versus like, do you think there's a difference?
I mean, yes, in that I would never want to say that they are the same because they are two very different fights. However, there's intersectionality, right, of where they come together. And there are definitely similarities between the two.
All of this hate, you think is just a form of control, a form of patriarchy, a form of, where's this fear coming from? Is it all the same?
Huh.
You-
My initial response was yes, but I'm like genuinely trying to think. I feel like in examining my own walk with anti-racism work, I feel like that's a different place for fear. Because when you look at why racism evolved the way that it did, it really was more about money and capitalism, and don't love that. Whereas I feel like with hate toward the LGBTQ community, there's the fear that they're getting it wrong. I feel like, right? Because if they allow curiosity about the subject and about that it could be fluid and that it's not one thing or the other, right? If they can't define it, yeah, I feel that people then have to take that inward and say, well, if it's not necessarily binary, where do I fit within that? Which that is the same thing I feel like with racism, right? Where we have to sit and go like, okay, I'm a part of that system. How am I showing up as a racist and work on it, right? Same type of thing here. So like I said, similarities. Same type of thing here where it's like, okay, if it's not one or the other, where am I at in my sexuality? And that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. They won't even be able to go there.
right?
Yeah.
My first moment of, I know exactly what I'm clear on when it came to sexuality was, before I discovered my sexuality, it wasn't, just an act, but it was when, my art, dancing. I realized the way I move in the world is sexual.
Yeah.
Everything about it is attracting people.
Yeah.
Regardless of whatever my preference may be, in in that area of who I choose to be my mate. I think it's funny how as I've not failed, but ended heterosexual relationships, I'd look to my best friends and be like, okay, by age 40, we're going to get married because I love you. I had this roommate who was divorced from a heterosexual marriage. She's gay, and she had just got married, and she moved in with me that same year. And her wife came, and they're probably some of the best roommates I've ever had. I never asked her about her sexuality. It never made me uncomfortable, but it was also like very considerate of her, and just how she approached the situation. It made me sad a little bit because, you know, she has experienced discrimination because of it. And she was in her like late to mid 50s. And right as she was moving out, she felt the need to sit down, and she started a conversation with me about, and I had said nothing about, you know, her and her wife or anything. She just said, you know, Sydney, the reason I picked my partner was because she's a good person. We have a great relationship. I want to make her happy, you know, and I love making her happy, and I respect who she is, her morals, her values, the way she lives her life. She inspires me. I want to spend every day with her. And I was like, I love that you shared that with me. I didn't tell her that, but I just smiled, and I was thinking, this is so beautiful because this is what I want in a partner, regardless of whether it's a male or female. And I just want to leave that there for people to ponder, because what do they ultimately want in a relationship? And when they look at others and judge others, how is that any different?
Yeah.
How is it any different? So
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I think where it gets complicated for people is relationships and sexuality, and that these are big, messy topics. And again, we want to try and boil it down into a this or a that, right? And it's just not that simple. And so you have to remain open. You have to reflect. You have to be willing to get uncomfortable. So that's our challenge to our listeners: is do some reflection, be willing to get uncomfortable, and open up your mind to the possibility of other options that are out there, not even for yourself, right? Just that there are other options exist, and they are not inherently bad. They're not inherently good. They're just things. They're just options that are out there for that people have as they move through this life. So let's bring it back to our initial title on the gay agenda. So we talked a little bit about what it was from the media's perspective, but what it actually looks like is living truthfully. That is high on the gay agenda. Being seen without apology, building safety and joy for ourselves and for the next generation. And that's truly what the gay agenda is all about. And if that is something that is problematic, then we have much bigger issues as a society.
If you've been listening to this episode thinking, damn, I wish I had someone like that walking with me, then we've got good news. You do. Each of us hosts coaches clients just like you. Sydney supports people reclaiming their worth beyond performance and perfection. Kristen helps individuals unlock their true potential by building confidence and self-worth. And as for me, I'm Kylie, and I coach unconventional humans navigating the hard, beautiful work of becoming who they were always meant to be. You'll find links to connect with us, learn more, or apply to work together in our show notes. We'd love to meet you right where you are. Be sure to subscribe or follow, depending on your platform, so you never miss the permission slip you didn't know you needed. And whether you're looking for support, have a topic you want us to unpack, or just need to drop a comment, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you next time.